My name is Tina Moore, and I am the Senior User Experience Designer for the Magento Business Intelligence product. So I spend my days working to optimize a tool that helps you create visualizations. So I thought it would be good to tell a story, or to help you tell better stories with data visualization. So, we live in this world with an ever-growing amount of data coming at us, and we also have a need for putting order to that data and being able to express it to other people. How do we do this, right? So we can do this through data visualization, which sort of gives us the ability to take these large quantities of data and put them into some human interpretable format. The average person can really only hold about 5 values in their minds before they need some sort of a visual analogy to be able to kind of understand what's happening. So that's what data visualization sort of allows us to do. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how we can use the tools that we have to tell better stories and make better data visualizations. So first off, talking about how data visualization can tell a story. So this chart might look pretty new to you, but this was actually made in the 1800s. It was done by a French civil engineer by the name of Charles Menard, and or Joseph Menard, sorry. It tells the story of Napoleon's troop movements to Moscow, and it packs a lot of data into this. So there's 6 or more different things he's actually showing us with this data. But the important story that he's telling is sort of this loss of troops. So we can see the number of troops represented by these bars. We have this tan bar that's showing them marching out towards Moscow, and this black bar on their retreat home. He also layers in a bunch of other information about weather, about their location, about river crossings. So he's packing a lot in here, and the story he's telling is one of immense loss. Because you can see at the beginning here, they leave with about 400,000 troops. And this bar just sort of dwindles as they get towards Moscow, and they only arrive with about 100,000 troops. And then by the time they get home, again, you can compare this little tiny sliver of a black bar to that large tan one that they left with, and it's only about 10,000 troops that made it back from Moscow out of that 400,000. So he's telling this story of this loss of troops and layering in all this information that gives you context about what happened to them. So let's talk about some best practices that you can employ when you're trying to create visualizations. Edward Tufte is sort of a pioneer of the field, and he has a lot of principles that are great to help us achieve this sort of clarity, precision, and efficiency, which he thinks is the excellency in data visualization. So the first is to show the data, and this is just to put the numbers out there for people to see. You don't want to hide things, you want to be honest with it. The next is to induce the viewer to think about the substance. So you don't want to think about the way you're presenting it. You don't want them to think about how you found it. They're supposed to think about the content that they're actually seeing represented there. Then you want to avoid distorting the data. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but there's ways that you can distort data to make people have different assumptions about what you're actually trying to tell them than what is accurate. We want to encourage comparisons. You want people to actually be able to look at what they're seeing and compare it with their own eyes and make the connections themselves. We want to show data at different levels. So this could either be through having drill downs or showing supporting evidence, but it's allowing people to sort of understand how this builds up to something. And then everything that you're showing should serve a clear purpose. So if you don't know what the piece of data is adding to your story, consider removing it, because it may be just adding more that the viewer has to take in, and it's not being as clear as it could be. So let's look at some examples of some good ones, some bad ones, and some ugly uses of data that you can do. Our first good example here is, may look a little familiar to some of you. So this is the London Underground map. And on the left here we have an older version, and then on the right we have a redesigned version by Charles Henry Beck, and it was done in the 1930s. So the original maps sort of projected the railway system onto a roadway map. So it shows exact distances, exact routes, but it's a little bit confusing. It's a little cluttered, right? So Beck redesigned this map, and he thought about his audience and realized that underground riders don't really care about where they are in relation to sort of this geographic map. What they care about is or how many stops that they have before they need to get off, and where those connection points are. So he was able to take a lot of these things out. He was able to remove some of that extraneous detail that wasn't helping them out and make something much more simple. And so you can see it's a lot more linear. It uses color sort of for hierarchy purposes, and it really emphasizes these stops that are placed approximately evenly, regardless of how they actually exist on the geographic map. And this sort of became a blueprint for cities across the world to use and adopt for their own transit systems. Let's talk about a little more modern example. So this is Google Research's music project, and this is an interactive tool that really allows the user to dig in different areas so they can see sort of how music trends have changed over time and what's kind of fed into that and how these different things break down, all the way down to the artist level, and you can see how they affected or how they added to those trends over time. So it's a really powerful tool that packs a lot of information in it, but keeps it in sort of a very accessible, fun way for the audience here to interact with. So let's look at some bad examples, some things to avoid. So 3 dimensions is never something you want to do. This is going to always hurt you and not help you. It's very hard for the human eye to interpret this. So with the graph on the top there, it's very hard to tell where things are lining up or actually understand how these things relate to each other. And then when we look at pie charts, which have their own issues, but a 3-dimensional pie chart is even harder. So if we're trying to compare item A and item C, we could say that they almost look the same, right? But in reality, item C is about half the size, and it's almost impossible to tell that in a 3-dimensional chart. So these are something to stay away from. And then on the right, we just have a data overload. So it's just too many data points. We're trying to show too much here. If you find yourself in this position, think about ways that you might want to break things up and that you could maybe show it in multiple graphs. Because the viewer really can't get anything out of this. You can look at this forever and not really be able to take anything away. And then we'll look at some ugly data usage. This is where we get into sort of that misleading data, how you can lie with data. A really common way you'll find is this this y-axis manipulation. So up on the left here, we can see these interest rates. They're growing at almost like an exponential rate, right? It's pretty scary. But then you notice that the 0 it's not actually a 0 y-axis. It starts at 3.14. So when we put the context in of that 0 axis, the differences almost entirely go away. You can see it's pretty much flat. So this is a way that is often used to manipulate data. You'll see this a lot out in different media. So pay attention if you're seeing this. And then the next one to talk about here is just drawing false correlations or making false stories for your viewers. So what are we supposed to take away from this graph? Internet Explorer was just so bad, it's inciting murder. And thank goodness it's going away, right? But again, this is just, we're plotting 2 things that have no bearing on one another, and it's a false correlation. So be careful to make sure when you're creating graphs, things are actually relating and impacting one another. So how do you tell your story? Well, first, let's just talk about data, right? So you're doing all this analysis to find sort of these important things that you want to share. You do a lot of analysis, you're kind of digging through things, you're finding these gold nuggets that you want to share, and that's the analysis side. And you don't necessarily want to show all of that. What your story is these little nuggets that you find, right? And how to present them is really what you need to figure out for your story. So you want to resist the urge to show all your work, even though you feel like it may be impressive or that you put a lot of time into it. In honesty, it usually serves to sort of confuse the audience and overwhelm them so they don't get nearly as much out of it as if you were to tell a better story with the small pieces that you've found. So how do we tell a good story? Well, the good news is that people love stories. So if you can tell a story with your data, you're going to be more impactful than if you're trying to just do a more, flat presentation where you give them everything to analyze themselves. A good way to start is to just think about your story structure. So good stories have a beginning, middle, and end. Think about that when you're trying to figure out what you're trying to communicate. With that comes narrative flow, so think about how you want to present your story. You can either tell it chronologically and sort of walk them through how you found this thing, or you can kind of do the reverse and start with sort of the impactful piece and then build in, layer in sort of supporting evidence, right? Next thing to remember is that there's power in repetition. So this may be something that's hard to think about, but repeating things makes people remember them more. So you want to think about also what people are going to say about your presentation when you leave. Think about sound bites. Is there something that they can take away and repeat and very easily summarize what you're trying to communicate to other people? And then finally, we need to answer these questions of who, why, how, and what before we get started. And this will sort of help frame the story you're trying to tell. So who, this is going to be your audience. Who are you actually telling this story to? And you want to try to get specific with this, because telling a story to everyone, let's say like if you say all external and internal stakeholders, that's such a broad audience with such differing understandings and needs that it's going to be very hard to communicate a good story for them. So by narrowing your audience, you can actually potentially have a better impact with the story you're trying to tell. And then what's your relationship to your audience? How do they see you? Are you sort of their data expert? Do you need to prove yourself? These are things to kind of keep in mind as we answer some of these other questions, and it's going to help guide you. So why are you telling this story? Well, there's an outcome you want, right? There's something that you found that you think there should be an outcome. So you should communicate that to your audience. They should know what you want them to do with this information, or at least what you want them to know at the end of it. And feel comfortable making suggestions about the next actions. It may be tempting to sort of just show the data and assume that these people are sort of smarter than me and they can make the decision from it. But in reality, like, you're the subject matter expert. You've been spending the time figuring this thing out and how it relates to things, and you should make suggestions about it. So how are you going to present this? There's some trade-offs here, right? So if you do a presentation, a live presentation, you have all the control over how people are interpreting what you're seeing, when they're getting certain points, the order with which they get the data. But you can't show nearly as much detail. If you do sort of a report, they can have a lot more detail, but you can't necessarily control how they're taking that in or the conclusions that they're drawing. You want to consider your tone. Are you trying to drive them to make a decision? Are you celebrating something? This could change the way that you actually talk about something. And then, again, keep in mind your relation to your audience, because it's really going to be what tells you how to answer these questions above. And finally, we just have to think about the data we're showing them. So again, think about those little nuggets that you found and what the true supporting evidence of that is, and do not show all of the work that you did to find them yourself. And finally, you have to choose the right visualization for the job. So choosing the right visualization. There's a lot of them out there. We saw some pretty complicated ones at the beginning of this, which may not really be what are going to serve you best in your day-to-day. So we're just going to talk about a few more common ones and some reasons why you'd use them and some best practices around them. So let's start with line charts. These are great for analyzing trends. So they're great with periodic data, so data over time. They're also good for comparing values, understanding some distributions or relationships. And the area chart can be good for visualizing some composition, so how something is being made up. You want to be careful about the number of lines you plot here. So this is the thing with the overloading data. If you get, you want to stay about 4 to 6 things here before it loses its impact and you can't really tell what's going on. And then with an area chart, you always want to have the most highly variable data at the very top so that it's most obvious how it's impacting things. So column and stacked column, again, they're good for trends, but they don't need to be just periodic data. They can also be categories. This is the one where you need to be really careful about including your zero access and having that, that context there for the viewer. We always want to show our names horizontally here. And if we're doing multiple series in a column chart, so columns next to each other, you again have to think about that overload and make sure you're not having too many series there. So you want to limit the number of those. And when you're using a stacked column, make sure that they actually represent a part of a whole, that there's a reason that they're together and stacked on top of one another. So we have bar charts and stacked bar charts, which are pretty similar to column ones, although they're not very good for using over time. So this is just for categorical data usually. You can use them to compare values, distribution, and then the stacked ones are for visualizing composition again. We also want to make sure we have the zero access here. But these are really good for categories with long names. So our brains like to read from left to right. And if we put the category name at the beginning here, we kind of just read it and go right into that piece of data. Again, make sure the bar charts are representing a part of the whole. Now we get to pie charts. So I mentioned earlier that pie charts kind of have some issues. But they can still be good to use for visualizing some compositions. So the thing with pie charts is that people are very bad at telling the angles. Like, we're really bad at analyzing the shapes and the sizes of those pieces of the pie and comparing them to one another. So if you're going to use one, make sure that you have less than 5 variables, so you're not overloading it, and that there's some differences in the sizes between them, and they're not all exactly the same. And then finally, make sure this is a meaningful whole. There's a reason that this is being showed all together. And then we have a pretty simple one here, but this is a numerical value. Sometimes these are great for just highlighting a really important piece of information and making it stand out. But don't use too many, because it'll kind of take away from them. And always pair it with some explanatory text. Tables and heat maps. So tables interact with a kind of a different part of our brain. They are more of our linguistic system. So we actually read tables rather than taking them in visually. So you don't really want to use a table in a presentation, but they can be great for showing a lot of information, a lot of depth. Heat maps are a little different. They are a bit more visual, so you can pick out the highs and lows really well with those. And these can be great for just putting a lot of data on there and understanding sort of the distribution of that data. So finally here we have some scatter plots and bubble charts. These ones are a little more advanced, but they're great for comparing values and relationships. You can see how one variable might affect other things in the set. Again, with these, you need to use a 0 axis to avoid distorting what's actually happening up there. And we always want to use circular plots, because it's much easier to compare them than if you were to have another shape. Like, your brain is better at comparing the relative size of those things. So let's say now we've picked our chart and we know exactly which visualization we want to use. How do we make the most of this, right? So this chart here may not be the best. It may not be doing the most it can to get the data across to our viewer. There's some best practices we can follow to sort of improve this. We want it to be clean. We want the data to be the focus. So you don't want your viewer to be looking at all these other things. Basically, when a viewer comes in, they have to take in all of this information, and all this extra stuff adds cognitive load. So it's time with which they have to spend interpreting the chart before they can actually even understand the data that you're showing. So you want to keep it clean, don't be afraid of white space, and always make sure you have enough context in there for them to understand. So you need to label explicitly. We want to consider hierarchy. So our brains like to read from left to right, top to bottom, and zigzagging down between. You can leverage that with how you're arranging information on this chart. And then work with the brain's expectations. So like that hierarchy, or our cognitive load limitations. So let's look at how we can actually improve this chart. So we can start out by removing this background and border. And right away, that removes some cognitive load from us. We can see the data a little more clearly. Next, we can remove some of these vertical grid lines. We don't really need them to tell where things line up. We can kind of do it without it. So, while you might want to keep the horizontal ones, you can know specifically where it's falling with the numbers here. We can consider getting rid of the vertical ones. Next, we can remove these data markers on the axis. They might be a little hard to see, but they're just adding more visual noise that we don't necessarily need. It was the dots actually on the line, sorry. We don't need them. Our brains can still tell sort of how the trends are moving here without those specific markers. Next, we're going to remove the tick marks on the axis. So that was what I was saying before. And that's just more visual noise. So we can clean up our axis labels. And this is, we can abbreviate our months. We don't need the whole word there for people to understand what we're trying to say. We don't need those decimal points for people to understand where this relatively is falling. And then let's be more explicit. So rather than having abbreviations, we can spell out average order value. We can make sure that all of our axes have labels. We can add the dollar sign back in so people know explicitly that they're seeing dollar values here. And finally, we can consider some hierarchy changes to have a better impact with this graph. So we can move the title over, so it's the first thing we see when we read this graph, and we can move the legend up, so it's the next thing as we read across, and we actually see that information before we get to the data. So we always want to think about striking a balance here, right? We want to remove things and make it clear as possible without removing context. So you need to make sure that you're never taking things away that are giving that context to the viewer. So this is the balance we sort of have to strike with this. So let's talk about how we could tell an e-commerce story, what one of these stories could look like. So I'm just going to do a really quick example. So I've done my exploratory analysis. I have all of these charts that I found that are telling me that there's this opportunity to reach out to a certain group of clients at a certain time. And I want to tell my marketers about this so that they can act on it. So I'm going to start by preparing my story. Who am I talking to? I'm talking to a group of marketers at my company, and I'm their data person. So I know my relationship to them. And they trust me that what I found is correct. So why am I telling them this? Well, I think I found this proactive strategy to actually reach out to customers and target them, and we'll have a higher conversion rate with them. So I want to leave my marketers with an actionable list of customers to directly reach out to. How am I going to do this? I think it'll be effective for me to do it in like a very quick 3-minute presentation so that they can go and act on this opportunity very quickly. And then finally, I've identified several graphs that are going to support my arguments, and I'm going to present them to the marketers. So here's the beginning of my story. There's a group of customers that, if targeted with our marketing during a specific window, are going to convert at a rate of 38% or higher, which is much higher than our typical conversion rate. So that's sort of the thesis of my statement here. That's my start out, right? Then we move to the middle of my story, which has my evidentiary support. So by looking at the volume of customers on this graph on the left, we can see that there's about 2,600 people that we could potentially reach out to, and they're ones who have placed orders this year. So by comparing that to the likelihood that they're going to make a subsequent purchase, we can find that we have about an additional 1,000 orders that we have potentially available to us from these clients who've already placed an order with us. So taking that, we can look at the average time between the first and second purchase. And I can see that's about 4 to 8 months. So if we reach out to those customers who've made a purchase 4 to 8 months ago, we can assume that we'll convert them at about 38%, which is higher than our standard or our average. So here's the list that our marketers can take away and go and act on right now. So just a simple story that I can tell, but it's leaving them with something that they can go and take action on right now. So let's talk about some tools and resources you have available. There's always, Excel and PowerPoint. They're pretty simple, but can be effective for making some simple visualizations. You also may have access to Magento's business intelligence tool, or any business intelligence tool, which will give you more power behind what you can actually create. So let's just talk a little bit about Magento Business Intelligence. So we do a lot at MBI to help you tell stories. We have a bunch of dashboards that we create with stories kind of baked right into them. So if you remember that story I just told, this is actually something that exists on one of our dashboards that's out of the box and ready for you to use if you have MBI. So we have this story sort of laid out for you with this actionable list of clients available. We also allow you to build your own stories in MBI. We have a very flexible platform that allows you to bring in sort of any metrics you want and slice and dice them in different ways with different visualizations to build out, something that might help you tell your stories better. So finally, just some resources for you if you're interested. We have a few books if you want to dig in a little bit more on data visualization. And then we actually have some e-commerce strategy available for you at one of our blogs. And if you want to learn more about MBI, there's some links at the bottom. Finally, if you ever want to get involved more deeply with data, we always have projects going on at MBI, and we love having feedback. So if you'd like to get involved, you can just find me afterwards, and we can have a chat. So I'll leave this up so you can, if you want to write down any of these resources. But otherwise, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer some.